I want to talk a little bit about this issue with China in the relation to Africa, because a lot of U.S. policy in Africa at the moment does seem to be driven by this new Cold War with China. Um, so, can you talk a bit about that in the sense of the U.S. is constantly accusing China of what is it they'll say, and its media mouthpieces, as you mentioned, are constantly accusing China of trapping Africa in debt, right? They're like building everything China does, whether it builds a port or like it builds a road or whatever it builds is like something malicious and evil. And they're really just trapping African countries in debt. It's a form of imperialism and colonialism. What's your response to that?
Well, my response is that it really belies the facts. The
Mm,
fact of the matter is that China's relationship with Africa, while it does have an element of self-interest, no economic activity, especially in the world right now, but just in general, cannot be without self-interest. I mean, China is very clear about this, that all relationships, regardless of where they have them economically, whether it's Africa, Asia, Latin America, the United States, Europe, wherever, is about mutual benefit. It's about win-win cooperation is often the phrasing. And that's no different with the African continent. But there's a special relationship with Africa that China possesses that you won't really hear about. And it's the fact that China and Africa's relationship dates way back. It's not something that's necessarily new. We've just heard about it over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years more so because the US military's presence has
mhm.
expanded on the continent. And that's because the US can't compete with China right now, and that's a huge uh, and difficult problem for the United States to really digest and address. But I mean, China's relationship with the African continent dates back to the post-revolutionary period beginning in 1949, when China actually invested a large part of its foreign policy in building cooperative relationships with independent governments. For example, Tanzania and Zambia, the Tanzam Railway, which still exists today. That was a project that was built in the 1960s, and it took many years to build. And it was done really on the basis not for profit, but for strictly solidarity. And
Mm,
that's where China and Africa's relationship starts. It starts with solidarity against what both countries experienced, which were forms of colonialism. Africa was carved up in the late 1800s by European powers, the United States being a direct participant in that, and struggled for nearly 100 years, some countries for 100 years, fighting to free themselves from direct, sometimes settler colonialism, but some form of colonialism which left all of the continent underdeveloped. And China has a similar experience. China went through what they call a century of humiliation, starting with the Opium Wars in the mid 1800s, all the way until the revolution in 1949. Most people don't understand that China had an infant mortality rate of 200 infants dying out of every 1,000 births, and that
yeah.
90 million out of 450 million people in 1949 were addicted to opium. These were the conditions that the West played a huge part in cementing. And so there's this bond, there is this solidarity that still exists. And that's why China uh, pays attention to Africa diplomatically and politically and talks about Africa maybe even a little bit more than anywhere else in some respects, especially in international press, because not only has it been so demonized with its very basic model of trade, which is far more favorable to African states than what the United States uh, offers, right? The United States doesn't offer 5G technology. It doesn't offer
Mm-mm.
infrastructure development. The United States really only offers the ability for African states to become more dependent financially on US corporations and international financial institutions that are mainly run by the United States, like the IMF. And then it offers military partnerships, quote unquote partnerships, which is really about domination. While China
Mhm.
doesn't do that, it's China says we have excess capital, we have excess labor, we have excess expertise that we can provide to African states in exchange for resources, in exchange for the capacity to be able to um, be more economically viable on the mainland through trade in things like uranium, oil, copper, whatever it is. Because China, although it does have rare earth minerals, doesn't have a lot in the realm of energy or a lot of other precious resources, which is needed to make production more efficient, cheaper, and more friendly to the environment. And Africa is sitting on a huge bed of these resources, which a lot of them are not even being developed at all, because a lot of these
Yeah.
countries, whether it's West Africa, the Sahel, whether it's Southern Africa, have not even been touched because of the ways in which Africa has been so dependent on foreign Western imperial powers. And so the whole idea of China imposing some sort of debt trap diplomacy is a really vile form of projection in a lot of ways, because that's what the United States and its Western allies have promoted for so many decades, beginning especially in the neoliberal period in the early 1980s when that began, structural adjustment programs and whatnot.
Hmm.
But the facts say that China is really flexible when it comes to its conditionalities. I mean, all of China's investments, Africa or elsewhere, are all long-term deals for the most part, and all of them provide provisions, which we saw with countries like the Central African Republic, that include the ability to renegotiate, include the ability to pay long term, and to, in fact, be forgiven if this debt cannot be paid. China has not necessarily reaped enormous rewards from Africa. In fact, in some cases, some of the projects end up in losses because they don't end
Hmm.
up being completed. This was outlined in an amazing book that I think everyone should read by Deborah Brottingam called um, China and African, the Dragon's Gift. And she outlines how, yeah, a lot of projects in Liberia and elsewhere sometimes go nowhere because African countries sometimes don't have the capacity. They're not as stable as China is right now, politically or economically. So they don't
Hmm.
have the ability to finish agricultural infrastructure projects at
Well,
times.
there's also the issue too, like to go off of what you're saying with the sometimes China having losses or projects don't get finished. There's also the fact that a lot of these governments are like they've been hollowed out because of neoliberalism that was imposed on the African continent. They've been hollowed out. There's a lot of corruption, and there's kind of like an elite that has a grip over the government. Like in a place like Zambia, for example, I actually interviewed the presidential candidate for Zambia's presidential election, which is taking place right now. I interviewed the socialist candidate, sorry, Fred Emembe. Uh, and I asked him this question. I posed this question about China and Africa that I asked you. Is it like is it true what the US says, what the West says about this sort of like colonial relationship that's being cultivated by China with this like debt trap or whatever? And how he explained it is like, look, we have a lot of corruption in Zambia. We have like a capitalist elite, and these are private Chinese companies that are carrying out these contracts, that are negotiating these contracts, and they're negotiating them with local corrupt African officials who ultimately end up, the project either goes nowhere, or that's the problem with the project, is like the foundational issue of the capitalist system that's imposed on all of these countries and the neoliberalism that's been imposed on all these countries. I just think that's really interesting that, for China to, and this is not to like say China's perfect, but for China to actually go into a country and be able to go into like a contract for various projects, they have to have a functioning government that can actually help carry out those contracts. And oftentimes it's just not the case for a lot of reasons related to US imperialism. And I can say, like, even in Lebanon, the Chinese have tried to invest in Lebanon. And in fact, the US has prevented some of that investment. But there's also like, what government are they gonna negotiate contracts with when you have such a corrupt and almost non-existent failing government? You know what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, you raise very good points. I think it's incredible the fact that a good number of these projects, not all, but a good number of them are finished. I mean, we can go to some place like Pakistan where they have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. That built the first public modern transit system in that country in its history. And that's a country that's very unstable politically and has
Mhm.
been a real hotbed of instability and division sown by imperialism. Its very founding is rooted in that. And
Mhm.
so the fact that these projects are completed in some respect, and the fact that China gets a lot of criticism for this, the fact that China will work with any government in order to take on these kind of projects that really do have an objective material benefit for global South countries, I think is a testament to a very sophisticated and positive political position. It's one that cannot be perfect under the given circumstances, but it does allow for countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa who have a long history of being under the thumb of the United States and its Western allies to diversify, to be able to develop infrastructure and an industrial and the possible rudiments of an industrial base, which was stripped from them for so many decades and even centuries. And that I think points to a very positive development, a phenomenon that is so resisted by the United States and explains a lot of the antipathy, if not all of the antipathy, that US officials have toward China's growing economic activity in Africa. It really is a kind of pearl clutching moment
Mhm.
for Western imperialism in the United States at the head of it, because it does signal a, a real trend that exists everywhere, not just Africa. We see in Latin America that with the resurgence of the pink tide, uh, relations with China are only becoming friendlier. And I think it really means that journalists, independent journalists, people on the left, people who sometimes I don't know what they consider themselves, but they consider themselves independent, need to look at this phenomenon, and when they do things like support Lula or support the Workers' Party in Brazil, or they support Evo Morales in Bolivia, or they support any of these progressive governments, Venezuela, understand that these governments see China as a very progressive force, and that this is the case for the majority of African governments as well, regardless of their political orientation, because there's only two options right now. There is invest with growing China and a country that actually does respect international law, or trade with a country that has a long history and is currently sowing the reproduction of neocolonial dependency everywhere, the United States, and then of course its allies. And it should be no not it should not be a secret which one of those is preferable.